magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Harlequins, specifically Traveling Players Patrol detachments that ever since the most recent chapter approved can appear alongside an Arks of Omen detachment without the player having to spend any CP or give up anything. Now, this has been an enormously popular include in competitive Craftworld's list, this Traveling Players option, despite the fact that Harlequins got a big nerf. You probably know that their 4-up invulnerable save that existed more or less across the army, except where it was 3-up, is now a 5-up invulnerable save. And that's a pretty serious blow, especially without any points decreases to offset it. That hurts a lot. Nevertheless, Harlequins have a lot to offer. They're a powerful toolbox. And they have something to bring to Craftworld, especially in the current meta in multiple forms. There are several different versions of these patrol detachments that are appearing in lists that are going all the way, right? Lists that have been undefeated at majors and super majors and GTs and done very well, piloted by some really top players. So there are competitive reasons to do this. There are aesthetic reasons to do this. Harlequins are just very cool models. They add a diverse flavor to your Craftworld's roster, and it doesn't matter what subfaction you're running. Harlequin allies will do well alongside Hail of Doom. They do well alongside Alpha Strike. They do well alongside melee lists, Swift Striker. There's whatever you're running, even if it's Eandon. Hey, Eandon. Harlequin allies have something to offer. So I'm going to be talking about the different types of Harlequin build. For the most part, they're pretty similar to one another that have been appearing in these lists. But, well, they're similar to one another in that they tend to utilize the same units with the same core bonuses. But actually, the 3 Harlequin Saedaths, Dark, Light, and Twilight, have all appeared in these undefeated lists. And the one that surprised me recently is Light, but there are very specific meta reasons why suddenly that's a thing. I'll talk about all of those. But before I do, I just want to mention that another reason to think about there's a reason to think about doing this that has nothing to do with rules, and a reason to think about not doing it. So the reason to think about doing it that has nothing to do with even rules or aesthetics is just that the barrier to including Harlequins in your list is super low, because the box of Harlequin players comes with 6 players, one of which can be built as a Troop Master, which is a powerful Harlequin's HQ that's very efficiently pointed, and you can get those boxes online for like $40, and then the Star Weaver, the transport, is also only about $40 for $80, for a little bit less than $80. You can add to your force 3 units that bring all of these dynamic new possibilities, adds like a new aesthetic vibe and look, and that's cool, and would also make a really solid jumping off point for building a small Harlequins army. The transport and the troops and the Troop Master are all things you're going to want in any Harlequin list. So that too is cool. My one word of caution before you take my advice and jump in is that with 10th edition just around the corner, there are no guarantees that in, say, 5 months, you'll still be able to run 400 points or 300 points of Harlequins alongside Craftworlders in a competitive way. In fact, GW has said that they're not going to be encouraging allied play in general, but they've also said that there will be exceptions. I have a sneaking suspicion that Harlequins probably will be, simply because if you go all the way back to 2nd edition, Harlequins started out as part of Craftworld's 4. It was possible back in the early days of 40k to run an all Harlequin army, but that was like a strange boutique move that only 13-year-olds with infinite resources could pull off. it wasn't really widely done. Harlequins for a long time appeared alongside Craftworlders as like combat attaches, and that's how mostly they functioned in the lore for a long time. And so if anybody is going to have access to these allied includes, I think it's going to be Craftworlders and Harlequins. But there are no guarantees, right? So if you're going to do this, go into it with your eyes open, knowing that maybe when 10th Ed rolls around, if you want to keep playing with those Harlequins, it's possible that you'd have to build the force out more to be able to run some Harlequins or whatever. So I don't know. You've been warned. I'm not worried about it, but I would not want a new player who's being very, very economical about the hobby to take my advice, build a very specific 2,000 point list that includes 400 points of Harlequins, and then be working towards that for months and get to June and suddenly the Harlequins can't, because we don't know what's going to happen. So you've been warned. I have one other disclaimer before we start talking interesting stuff, and that is that I'm going to be running through what has worked well at top tables, why I think it's working well, but I don't have any new advice to offer you clown experts out there. So if you're already a really solid GT player who's running Harlequins, you're not going to learn anything, and so you've been warned. This is aimed at people who are transitioning into or trying to figure out how to include Harlequins in their forces, not those of you who are already experts. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's talk about what Harlequins are, what they have to offer, and what is currently working. So Harlequins are an elite force. They, for a long time, as I said before, they weren't even a standalone army, but they have very few units. If you flip it through your Eldari Codex, which delightfully now includes all of the Harlequins, it was not always a thing, you will see that they have a sum total of like 8 data sheets, which is borderline laughable as an independent faction. And the only thing that makes that not totally bizarre is that most of those units are so highly customizable. So a unit of Harlequin players, the standard troop option, can be equipped as pretty cheap, pretty disposable OBSEC troops at 65 points for 5 of them. Those 5 Harlequins are super fast. They can advance and charge just like Banshees can. And that basic squad in melee puts out 25 attacks because they have 4 attacks apiece, but the standard Harlequin's blade gives them +1. It's only strength 3. That's the downside, but then -1 AP, and there are lots of ways to spend a few points to invest in those troops to start moving them towards being a more elite combat unit. So if you give them all upgraded melee weapons, caresses and embraces and kisses, now they're only 20 attacks, but now they're all at strength 4 with -2 AP. They're doing flat 2 damage. And there are these stratagems for those 3 pieces of equipment, the caress, the embrace, and the kiss, such that if you have just one model in the unit that has the thing, you can trigger the stratagem. So arguably the best of these is Kiss of Death. If you have a single model in the squad with a kiss, a Harlequin's kiss, you can spend 1 CP, and then when you make those wound rolls, and remember even the regular Harlequin blade gives you +1 attack. So if you're not going to kit all of the models in the unit out with an upgraded melee weapon, the kiss is especially good because the blades are rolling more dice, and the way Kiss of Death works, all of your 6s to wound do mortal wounds, caps out at 6 mortals, but you can have like a 70-point squad of Harlequins if you just upgrade 1 melee. That stands a pretty good chance of putting out a bunch of mortal wounds on a CP. And then if you keep giving them stuff, a couple models can get Harlequin fusion pistols, which do like D6 +2. They're like basically short range bright lances, but with a different damage profile. They hit really, really hard. And because the transports are open topped, if you have a troop riding around in a transport, they can fire the pistols out of the transport. That's pretty cool. Neuro disruptors can do a mortal wound if they just hit. Not quite as sexy as the other stuff, but not bad. The point is that these basic troops can either be a disposable trading melee threat that's obsec, that's super fast, that can advance and charge. They're also -1 to hit in melee natively, which is good. That mattered more back when they had the 4-up invuln because they were a little bit stickier, and now Harlequins melt like snow in sunlight. But they're nevertheless at only 65 points, in many ways, Harlequins are comparable to Banshees, right? Banshees can advance and charge. They hit really hard. They have tricks to do mortals. Well, Harlequins work that way too, except you have an option to run super stripped down Harlequins that are no more expensive than a squad of Rangers or a squad of Dire Avengers. You don't have that option with Banshees, or you can trip them out and make them really hard hitting, and that's cool. Every single one of these Harlequin lists is obviously going to include, because it's a patrol not Harlequin lists, Harlequin detachments, is obviously going to include at least one unit of players. For one thing, it's compulsory because in a patrol detachment you need an HQ and a regular troops unit, but also they're just a good tool, really. The ability to get in and trade on an objective or screen opponents out in your backfield in the early game, or just be a credible melee threat really counts. There are a lot of different ways that players are using them. The Starweaver, the 95-point Harlequin transport that can carry 6 warm bodies, is also a pretty standard go-to unit. It is a tool for positioning your clowns where they need to be, and it has additional utility as kind of a semi-durable throwaway unit. It's nice to have a transport that's under 100 points that has any invuln at all. It moves 22 inches when it advances, like all of the elf bikes, and it has a couple of shuriken cannons on it, which is, their shuriken cannons aren't bad. So it adds a little credible shooting. And the fact that it's open topped is also in many matchups valuable. Because you took a couple of fusion pistol players, or because you've got a Death Jester in there, and I'm going to talk about the Death Jester build in just a minute. There's not a whole lot to say about the Starweaver on the front end. It's not like it's customizable. The other auto include in these lists is the Troop Master there's a particular build involving a Warlord trait and a relic, which I'll get to in just a moment. But the Troop Master is a super affordable little powerhouse with a 75-point base cost, 2-up weapon skill, 2-up ballistic skill, standard 3s for strength and toughness, 5 wounds, 6 attacks, and he's always going to get some kind of weapon upgrade. The melee weapons are a 10-point upgrade on the Troop Master because he has so many attacks. You can also give him a fusion pistol or something for 5. I think you probably don't want to give him the Neuro Disruptor. That would be the or something. But what really trips out the Troop Master is the Warlord trait A Foot in the Future and the Relic Kegarox Rose. There's another optional upgrade that some people are giving. Harlequins have access to these pivotal roles there, which are a little bit like Exarch upgrades or like mini Warlord traits. You could potentially also give your Troop Master Queen of Shards, which is a 25-point pivotal role that on a 5-up to wound shuts down invulnerable saves, which can be really good. I have a tough time fitting this particular upgrade in because of how I use my Troop Master. The other two that I mentioned, the ones that I think just kind of non-negotiable, are amazing. A Foot in the Future. Each time this character advances, you don't make an advance roll. Instead, until the end of the phase, you add D3 plus 3 to the movement characteristic, which makes it just much more reliable. And then when you roll a charge for the Warlord, you roll the 2 dice and you add 6 to the result. And because Harlequins can advance and charge, that's just absolutely insane. The threat range on that Troop Master, especially if it jumps out of a transport, right? So it goes 3 inches out of the transport, It has a native 8-inch move. It advances 8 plus D3 plus 3, and then charges 2d6 plus 6. That is brutal. And then when it arrives, it can use Kegarak's Rose to bring the pain. Kegarak's Rose is a relic that replaces the Harlequin's Kiss, so you have to buy the Kiss for 10 points, but then it gives +2 strength instead of +1, so we go to strength 5, -2 AP, flat 3 damage. Flat 3 damage weapons are just so freaking good in 40k, because every failed save kills a Terminator, or kills one of those annoying squat bikes, or whatever other irritating 3 wound model is running around in your opponent's force. And if your opponent doesn't have stuff that has 3 wounds, well, 3 damage, I mean, that's a big chunk of damage to durable targets too. Also, each time you make an attack with Kegarak's Rose, you can re-roll the wound roll, which means that targets that are really tough, right, that you would be at strength 5, you would be wounding on a 5 or a 6, which is pretty much anything that's tough. Even something that was strength 8 or toughness 8, you'd still be at 5s. Your chances of inflicting wounds are now a little bit better than 50%, so it's, you know, into something that's very tough, it's better than being like strength 8 against something that is T8, and that's pretty great. So Kegarak's Rose significantly increases the threat potential of that Troopmaster, and pretty much everybody who's running a Harlequin patrol is running a Troopmaster with a foot in the future in Kegarak's Rose. And so those 3 units that I've just mentioned, those are the non-negotiable ones. If you're running a Harlequin patrol, and you do want to take a page from the book of top players, you've got a transport, a Harlequin troop with some loadout. People are using different loadouts, and then you have the Troopmaster with that build. Now, pretty much all of the other Harlequin units also have appeared in these lists, with the possible exception, I don't know if we have recently seen a Void Weaver. Probably at some super major in the UK, there's some clever player who went 5-0 and had one in there, and I don't know about it. But as far as I know, ever since the big points increase to Void Weavers, at least in the allied lists, we haven't seen those show up. But everything else, the Solitaire, the bikes, the Shadow Seer, all of it potentially could have a role. But I will say that after the 3 units I mentioned, if there's a 4th unit that is an auto include, it is in fact the Death Jester with Favor of Kegarak and Harvester of Torment. Now, this is a pretty potent combo, if a bit expensive, because the Harvester of Torment ability got a big points increase to 40, which increases the overall cost of the Death Jester by over 50%, because the Death Jester is natively 70. But here's how the combo works. The Death Jester is armed with a Shrieker Cannon, which has a 30-inch range, is Assault 3, Strength 6, -2 AP, flat 2 damage, and it has the Shuriken ability, and it lets you ignore Look Out Sir, which is cool, but on its own, and he's got a 2-up ballistic skill, so that's good. It's cool, but on its own, it's not dangerous enough to make you really want to spend the 70 points on the Death Jester. However, what Harvester of Torment does is that each time the model makes a ranged attack, unmodified rolls of 6 to hit score 3 additional hits. Now, when you're rolling Assault 3, you would have a 50% chance of pulling that off. But then Favored of Kegarak allows you once per turn, when you make a hit roll, wound roll, or saving throw, after making the roll, which is key, you can treat the result as an unmodified roll of 6 instead, which means you roll your 3 dice to hit. You have a 50% chance of getting a 6, and then regardless of what you get, you can set one of the other dice to a 6, which means you have a 100% chance of getting at least 3 hits, a 50% chance of getting 6 hits, and then the remaining dice have a pretty good chance of hitting, right? So you could, because you're hitting on 2s, so you're putting out a lot of hits at strength 6 -2 flat 2 that can ignore Lookout Sir, which can let you pick up important support characters. It's just really good. And the fact that he can fly around in that super speedy 5-up invuln -1 to hit transport and just do this with a 30-inch range, get really good angles, that's pretty powerful. 110 points is a lot. You know, that might not necessarily fit into your list, but it's a really good tool. And there are other really good tools offered by stratagems for several of these units. I will say that as good as the Harlequin stratagems are, once you pay the CP for the Warlord trait and the relic on the Troopmaster, certainly if you then spend to also give the bonuses to the Death Jester, not only do you not really have CP left over for your regular Craftworld Eldar to get relics and warlord traits or go into the webway or whatever, you know, that's a disadvantage because you probably want to save 2 for Phantasm. But at that point, it's also going to be difficult as you generate CP to necessarily spend it on the Harlequin stratagems. This is the reason why currently, even though he's really freaking good, that I'm not able to get the Death Jester into my own competitive lists. It's mostly about the CP. The 110 points is not nothing either, but lots of very good players are making it work really well. He's an incredibly powerful tool. But I'm not going to cover all the Harlequin stuff in this video. It would be too much. I will say that there's a Harlequin strat that lets your units, one of your units, disappear back into the webway and then pop out of strategic reserves somewhere. And this can be virtuosos of the webway. It's like that. It's a bit like that Warp Spider Web of Deceit power. Not exactly the same, but this can really help with behind enemy lines, and it's only 1 CP. That's worth mentioning. A lot of the other really good Harlequin stuff is a little too expensive at 2 CP. Prismatic Blur gives an infantry unit a really good invuln save, which can be clutch if you need those players to hold on to an objective. But 2 CP is a lot, or if you want to keep your Troopmaster alive. So as good as a lot of the Harlequin stratagems are, I think we're, for the most part, only looking at using the pretty cheap ones. The Curtain Falls is another one to mention. You can have an infantry unit fight, which includes the Troopmaster, charge, fight, and then if the transport is within 6 inches of them, when you make the consolidation move before your opponent hits you back, you jump back into the transport, escaping combat, and your opponent is not able to hit you back. That said, the transport is only like 7 inches away from enemy models, so it's and now it doesn't have a 4-up invuln anymore, so it's exposed, but it's a good trick to be aware of. There's some other cool ones, but those are some bread and butter moves. So the biggest decision, I think, if you are going to run this Harlequin patrol, I think you have a unit of troops. You're going to have to decide what to give them, and what you give them is going to depend on what you want their role to be. I'll talk about that in a moment. You have the Troopmaster, who's a powerful killer and is super quick on his feet. You have the transport to move it all around and then also be pretty effective, somewhat durable, like blocking unit, deep strike denial, objective control. Maybe you also have that Death Jester. Your big decision is going to be what Saedath to choose, and each of these, the Saedath that you choose is going to depend on the meta that you're playing into and what exactly it is you want your Harlequins to do. They all have uses. So Dark Saedath, Dark Deeds, which is popular right now, if you choose that one, your Harlequins have better armor penetration in melee, which is really, really good. I think before, if Armor of Contempt had not gone away with chapter approved, this would be like the only one to seriously consider if you wanted your Harlequins to be killers. Now it's not compulsory, but the ability to go to -3 on the souped up Harlequin melee weapons, or -2 on the regular swords, or on Kegrock's Rose -4, and just deny saves at all to models that have a 3-up. That's really good. It significantly increases the killing power. They're going to do most of their killing in melee. And the other thing that Dark does for you is it gives you access to a free fight on death ability, which is especially good for the Troop Master. So I played a game recently in which I charged in the same turn with a unit of Banshees, a Troop Master, and I think some Shining Spears. And there was no way for me to prevent my opponent from interrupting somewhere. The Shining Spears had not charged something that was constituted a dangerous interrupt, really. But when my opponent interrupted and attacked my Troop Master, it wasn't really a big deal, because even if you kill my Troop Master, it still gets to fight on death. It wasn't going to live through your turn anyway. So that's also a solid bonus. It's just you take away some of your opponent's tricks. There's also the Dark Stratagem, the Silken Knife for 1 CP, shuts down Overwatch fire, which for your fragile clowns that don't have that 4-up invuln anymore can be really important. You can often, with Harlequins, because they have such a long charge, get around Overwatch simply by charging from out of line of sight, or even in some cases out of range, if you have that +6 to the charge, out of range of a 12-inch weapon. But being able to shut down Overwatch, we all know from having Banshees, I'm sure you all know this, is super good. So Dark is the Saedath to choose if what you really want your Harlequins to do is be aggressive melee killers, and that is their primary job, is target elimination. The Twilight Saedath is the other sort of first equal pick right now, and there are a lot of very good elf players that I respect who argue that it's really the only choice, that you should be choosing Twilight, not Dark. There have been undefeated super major lists that have taken Dark, and so I'm going to say that you're overstating it probably if you say that Twilight is the only pick, but there is a very particular reason to choose Twilight. So the way the Twilight bonus works is that, first of all, when characters with that bonus fight or make a heroic intervention, when you fight, you get a bonus if you charged that turn or you made a heroic intervention, and it's a bonus to your attack characteristic. So the Dark Harlequins hit a little harder against armor. Twilight get an extra attack, which also helps with getting the Harlequin's Kiss stratagem for 1 CP to trigger. So if you have more attacks, you're hitting more, which means you're making more wound rolls, which means potentially you're generating more 6s to get those mortals. But here's arguably the more important part. Each time a model with this characteristic makes a pile-in or consolidation move, it can move up to an additional 2 inches, which adds up to an additional 4 inches of movement if you're making both, almost 4 inches of movement, if you're making both the pile-in and the consolidation move, it's not immediately clear why that's awesome, but here's why it's awesome. Remember that Troop Master with a foot in the future? So he has the 8-inch move. He's advancing D3 plus 3. He's charging 2d6 plus 6. Having the extra inches for pile in and consolidate means that on turn 1, pretty reliably on just about any board, he can get into the opponent's backfield for behind enemy lines. So you have and he's so little that he can run around or through a lot of screens. He's breachable, so he can run through. He breaches, so he can run through walls. So you have this character that can score you behind enemy lines on turn 1. That's not that expensive in terms of points. That's going to hit really hard, delete something, get you those secondary points. Yes, he's an auto kill for assassination. So if you're including if you're running the Harlequin list and you have the Troop Master, you can't have a lot of other disposable characters because you don't want to be giving up a bunch of points for assassination. So it's something to consider. But it is for this reason that you can have a powerful turn one trade that also gets you behind enemy lines and can reach just about anything. If your opponent, if you don't use it first turn, if you have something else that scores behind enemy lines on first turn, on turn two, if you position that transport and he's in there somewhere, it's very hard for your opponent to prevent that small base squirrely little model from getting where it needs to be to go after something really key, and maybe it's scoring behind enemy lines on turn two. So it's that extra movement, and I think to new players, or even to a lot of intermediate players, the notion that you get an extra 2 inches on pile in and consolidate, that doesn't trigger like a wow response. But when you think about the exact distances that you need to cover to trigger behind enemy lines on turn one, and what the odds are of getting the numbers that you need when you roll, those extra inches actually really count for a lot. I will say that some intermediate players are still taking the Twilight Fang instead of Kegrok's Rose. It replaces a power sword, so I think the model looks cooler. It also has +2 strength, -3 AP. It's flat 2 damage, not flat 3, but it adds additional attacks equal to the current battle round. I am told by top Harlequin players, I'm a Harlequin weekend warrior, I'm not a clown expert. But I am told that if you run the math, the reason everybody's choosing Kegrok's Rose is that into the vast majority of targets in the meta, that's a more important tool, having that flat 3 damage where you re-roll the wound rolls. The math is better. It's doing better into most targets. I haven't tried to work out all the math myself, but I'm taking their word for it. They seem to know what they're talking about. The stratagem Malicious Frenzy for Twilight allows you to count hit rolls of 6 as automatic wounds. It's like what's it called? Hail of Doom, which is, so if you're taking the naked Harlequins with the Harlequin blade that don't have the strength bonus, in a Twilight list, that makes a lot of sense, because you can Malicious Frenzy them on the front end and get some auto wounds, and then it doesn't really matter as much that you don't have the bonus. But on the other hand, we've already determined that in any Harlequin list, any list including a Harlequin detachment, CP will be at a premium, and so you may not be able to pull that off. So Dark gets you the most murderous clowns. Twilight gets you clowns that are very nearly as murderous, and also the Troop Master can pull this really cool extra little bit of fancy footwork to score you those critical secondary points on turn one. And you really need, with Craftworlds right now, to be basically maxing out your secondary scores in competitive games, because it's very difficult to get all the way there on the primaries unless you're tabling your opponent, and then it's kind of a win more thing. Now, 2 weeks ago, I would have said that Light Saedath is not a thing for traveling players. But suddenly, indirect fire is kind of back a bit in the meta, partially because of the guard mortars that have been good for a while. They were already here. It's a thing to worry about. But the other thing is these new Space Marine Desolators, Primaris Desolators. Weirdly, they didn't make a big splash online in terms of what people were talking about when they appeared, but last weekend there was a super major over in the UK where they were this incredibly dominant force on the table, and it's not obviously apparent when you look at their data sheet. They have what looks like pretty good indirect. So they have those enormous grenade launcher guns that people are being really mean about how they look online. It's like, I don't know. I think 40k weapons and armor has always been sort of over the top and ridiculous. I just think it looks sort of 1980s and heavy metal. I'm fine with it. But they've made a lot of people really mad. I'm not a Space Marine player, so I guess I don't have any skin in the game. But they have direct fire profiles, which are pretty good. They either are like a moderately lame missile launcher, or like like a Bright Lance or something. And then they can also fire in the same turn that they do that direct fire. They can fire their indirect weapons. And the Sergeant has this weapon that's 48 inches, heavy D6, strength 6, -1 AP, flat 2 damage, but they get more AP in the Devastator Doctrine. It's a blast weapon. And there's a way for the Sergeant to give himself a ballistic skill of 2, and then they're still hitting on 3s even with the nerf to indirect fire. And there are other tricky tricks, like if you're in an Iron Hands list, it's like they don't take the penalty for moving and shooting the heavy weapon, and I think they're also rerolling 1s. They're like hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s. In a Space Wolf list, they're hitting on 2s with a stratagem that like allows them to ignore modifiers, not just to hit, but 2 ballistic skill modifiers. And then all the other models, and then I think there's like a fire on death rule also for some of these Space Marine sub-factions, and a way to resurrect the Sergeant. And then everybody else in the squad also has a lesser indirect fire weapon with a 36-inch range that's heavy D3, strength 4, -1 but -2 in the Devastator Doctrine, 1 damage. And so with stratagems and the right sub-faction, there are all these tricky tricks that Space Marines can pull suddenly. And so you have these lists with like 3 squads of these things and significant indirect fire on tops of like various types of bike or other ways for Space Marines to be quick. And suddenly like they're getting the angles on you and they're shooting your fragile elves out of line of sight. And so for this reason, if you're playing into a meta with a bunch of Imperial Guard mortars or like Iron Hands desolators, and indirect fire is a thing in your meta, you might really want to consider running your Harlequins as Light Saedath, and also frankly starting a bunch of your Craftworlders in reserve with Phantasm, or maybe sticking them in transports. I think we have to start thinking again the way we were thinking back in like July. If this indirect fire thing continues to catch on the way it did in the super majors in the UK over the weekend. So what Light Saedath does for you is it gives you what's sometimes called trans hitman. So nobody targeting the unit with a Light Saedath, Blaze of Light, will ever hit on a 1 through 3. So 50% of your opponent's shooting will always miss, regardless of ballistic skill bonuses, whatever else. And in a Light Saedath list, when you make a normal move or advance in your shooting phase, you count as having remained stationary. It's not really a big thing. It can help with the pistols and the transport or whatever, but really shutting down, making your Harlequins less vulnerable, even that transport less vulnerable to that indirect fire, so that Desolators can't just pick up that transport in a round of shooting, counts for something. And then the light stratagem lets you move 6 inches away when somebody declares a charge against you. It's good. You might use it. But really, the reason to play light is that you're concerned about losing your Harlequins to indirect fire. And there was a list that went undefeated over the weekend at a super major that included two units of players. It was a Light Saedath. The Troop Master, I think it had a couple of Skyweavers, the bikes, like more Quins than usual. There was a Solitaire, and there's a really interesting interview involving Vic Vijay, who is piloting the list. He's a top player, and if there's a podcast called 40K Fireside, you can listen to him talk about piloting the list and playing against Space Marines in this new indirect fire meta and what that means. So if you're interested in more details, I would definitely check that out. It's a cool podcast, and it's the most recent episode at the time that I'm making this, the one about the Manchester super major. But he was thinking specifically about playing into those Imperial Guard mortars and dealing with really fast Dark Angel Talon Masters stuff that can be in the backfield turn one, and so he was choosing light for durability, so he wouldn't be the victim of some kind of alpha strike move. So there it is. If you do want to consider putting Harlequins into your lists, I think you start with the Troop Master, the 5 players, the Transport, and then you start making choices based on what you want them to do. And that's going to depend on what your overall battle plan is like. If you definitely need to, in most matchups, score behind enemy lines every turn, one of those turns is maybe going to be your Troop Master, and so you build for that. Maybe having the Troop Master in your list means that you can pull something else out. Maybe you don't need that 60-point unit of disposable Wind Riders. Maybe you don't necessarily need to quicken something into the backfield on turn 1 because the Troop Master can get there without quicken, and so you're using your Warlock or your Wraithseer or whatever it is for some other cast on turn 1, right? You plan it. If what you need is more target elimination trading melee, and you're less worried about getting all the way to the opponent's backfield on turn 1, maybe Dark really is the move. And if you're playing in a meta with a lot of indirect fire, you're concerned about the indirect fire, and you need to keep your Harlequins alive so that they can do the things you need them to do, even if they're doing those things slightly less effectively, light might be the pick. Every time you put something into your list that is a clown unit, obviously something else has to come out, or if you're building it from the ground up, you have less points for something else, fewer points for something else. So there's a trade-off, and what you don't want to do is include some Harlequin unit that has a Craftworld corollary that can do the same thing more efficiently or more effectively. So that is something to watch out for. Skyweavers, for example, are really good, but they're the same price now as a unit of Shroud Runners, and Shroud Runners have some pretty sick tools, and so I wouldn't necessarily take a unit of Skyweavers unless you don't have any fast attack slots left in your Craftworld's detachment, or if there's something very specific that you know that the Skyweavers are going to do that Shroud Runners would not do as well. They are a little bit more durable than Shroud Runners, arguably, so there's that, because they have an invulnerable save and a native -1 to hit. They certainly do more damage at close range, but in general, elves have a lot of things that do a lot of damage at medium to close range. So you think about what else is in your list. Where do you need stuff? What secondaries am I playing? What sort of target elimination options do I need access to? And what's my overall style of play? How do my Harlequins fit with that? If you're playing a toolbox list where you have a particular type of solution to any kind of obstacle you could encounter, but it's a different solution, you think about how the Harlequins fit into that. If what you're doing is trying to out-trade your opponent in melee in virtually every game you play, then you ask yourself, at what point do I take Harlequins instead of another unit of Banshees? Because I do think one of the trade-offs with the Harlequins is, even though you're not spending 2 CP on the detachment itself, you are spending a minimum of 2 CP, I think, on relics and warlord traits. So there's a cost there. And then I think we already established that the Troop Master is probably a goner. So that affects how many deletable characters you can afford to take over on the Craftworld side. These Traveling Players detachments are really good, but they're not an auto include. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are a newer player figuring out how all of this works, having models that have three or more units with different rules and access to different stratagems who don't have access to Strands of Fate, it's more to keep track of, right? It makes things a little bit more complex, and so there's also that to consider. But it's just so much fun to have access to new and different tools, as variable as Craftworlds are, even though we have lots of units to choose from in the codex that are viable in competitive play, it does freshen things up, right? To have access to some new stuff that also paints up differently and just has a different look and a different vibe. And that's really cool too. I will say lastly that when you're outfitting your players, in terms, if you're only buying one box, right, you're making a big commitment, unless you're magnetizing, when you decide what they're going to run with. And as tempting as it is to give them, to trip them out all the way, right, give them all of the upgraded melee weapons and throw 2 fusion pistols in there, I often run my Harlequin patrols that way. I think it's effective, it's cool. I will say there's a lot to be said for having, especially in a Twilight Saedath build, these really efficient trading melee units that are so cheap that you can just kind of afford to throw them away. I really like the build where you just have the one dude with the kiss so that you can trigger a bunch of mortals on the charge if you want to. But the unit is still, it's as disposable as a unit of rangers. It can run onto an objective and just swipe it from the opponent with OBSEC. There's a lot of stuff in the game that even those super cheap Harlequins are dangerous to. So I would think really hard about how you're going to use them and how you might be able to use a cheap, fast trading unit before outfitting them with the really hard-hitting stuff, because Craftworlders have a lot of really hard-hitting melee that's reasonably expensive. A unit of Scorpions with Crushing Blow and the Biting Blade, or the Banshees with the upgrade and the Piercing Strike, or any sort of upgraded Shining Spears. All of those units are, yeah, they're better than 5 naked Harlequins, but they're coming in at over 100 points. And coming in at like 65 or 70 points, that's a real trading asset. Oh, lastly, I should mention the Shadow Seer. I didn't talk about Shadow Seers at all, but after the Death Jester, the Shadow Seer can be a popular include in a lot of these lists. It's the Harlequin equivalent of a Farseer, and I think 2 of the most popular psychic powers. One is Mirror of Minds, which adds to the overall mortal wound output of your Eldari. It has a warp charge value of 7. You select an enemy unit within 18 inches, and that enemy unit suffers D3 mortal wounds, and then you roll off with your opponent, and you keep rolling off, and if you win or tie, they just keep taking a mortal wound. The whole thing maxes at 6 mortal wounds, or until the opponent wins. But that can be really good. It's a little bit swingy, but it's just this extra tool. And then Twilight Pathways is the other one. It's got a warp charge value of 6. You select a core or character within 6 inches of the Psyker, and that unit can immediately make a normal move, advance, or fall back as if it were your movement phase. If it does so, it can't declare a charge, but it can shoot, which can help you get angles or get close enough to use fusion pistols. There are options. It can be good on a Death Jester. Okay, I think that's what I've got. Obviously, this could be much longer. There are all sorts of other options. Most of the Harlequin's models have tools, right? But again, the target audience for this is people who are interested in giving Harlequin allies a whirl, and they want to know what's working well at the high tables, and that I think we've largely covered. Nevertheless, if you have your own ideas about what works well in a Traveling Players detachment running alongside an Arks of Omen detachment, please talk about that in the comments below. Feel free to simply say hello to help out the algorithm. And I've got to say it because I always say it. I really appreciate my patrons. If anybody out there has not already clicked like and perhaps subscribe, I hope that you will consider doing those things. The Patreon privileges include access to a Discord, which is a lively and inclusive community that I've really enjoyed honestly being a part of. You get early access to some content and the ability to consume the content as a podcast, and it really does help me justify the amount of time that goes into creating this content, and it helps to keep me invigorated about staying on top of it. So I hope that you will like and subscribe and consider signing up for the Patreon if you have not already done so. So that's it. That's what I've got. I'll be back hopefully soon-ish with something new. And again, just a reminder, as we get closer to 9th edition, I will be transitioning out of tactics into other non-rules related stuff, lore, how craft worlds have developed over time, in general information about how to play the game well or effectively, or keep everybody happy while you do, that isn't linked to any particular set of rules that's going to be out of date in a few months. I look forward to talking to all of you again soon, and until then, best of luck in your next campaign. Take care.